Carol felt her stomach do a somersault as she looked at the house of her new neighbor. How on earth could this have happened? Carol Smith was immensely proud of her neighborhood. Having spent 10 years there, she had witnessed people come and go. She loved the safe, suburban feeling that the neighborhood gave her. She wouldn't change it for the world. This was where she was supposed to be. Then something happened that would completely change her view on this neighborhood. It would also change Carol's life forever. It was around midnight when Carol heard it. She awoke suddenly to the sound of a van speeding down the road. She wasn't at all happy about being woken up. She yawned, rubbed her eyes, and looked out of her bedroom window onto the street beyond. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. She hoped that she was still dreaming, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case. She looked out of her window and over to the field near her house. There was a small house there that sat in the darkness. For years, rumors had circulated about this house. Just looking at it made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. It was believed to be haunted. Something terrible was said to have happened inside it many years ago. Carol stared out of the window. There appeared to be some kind of movement behind the window of the small house. Something was inside the house, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what. It was as if someone was living in there. The next morning, with the daylight making her feel a little more at ease, she plucked up the courage to go over to the house and introduce herself to whoever was inside. She even baked some of her famous muffins to give to them. She had to know who was inside the house and what business they had there. As she got closer to the house, she started noticing things that she hadn't previously registered. This wasn't just any old house. There was something different about it. When she was 20 feet away from the house, she couldn't help but laugh. The house that looked so sinister and scary in the darkness seemed pathetic during the day. It was tiny. Whoever had decided to move in must have been mad. She wondered whether whoever it was didn't have a choice. Perhaps they had lost their own home. Her laughter stopped abruptly as she noticed a man watching her from the small porch of the house. Her amusement turned to dread. Her new neighbor introduced himself as Derek. Carol had so many questions that she wanted to ask this mysterious man. She had been thinking about it all night, while she couldn't sleep. When Carol spoke to him, he retreated behind the front door. He seemed to be trying to conceal something from her. He was acting very suspiciously. Her curiosity got the better of her. She had to know more. Following their short conversation, Carol began to walk away from the small house. Something wasn't right. She was absolutely sure of it. Why wasn't he answering any of her questions properly? What did he have to hide? She felt extremely uneasy. A few weeks passed, and at this point, she had spoken to all of her neighbors about the situation. They stood outside chatting and laughing amongst themselves about the tiny house. This had to be a joke. The man couldn't be serious. Surely, as far as she could tell, Derek didn't have a job. If he did, he must have been working from home. She had been watching him intently from her house for the past few weeks and knew what his schedule was like. He was never out on his morning commute and didn't seem to ever leave his house after 5 p.m. Then one night, Carol noticed something. It was something that she never thought she would see in her perfect neighborhood. Carol got up at 11:30 p.m. to let her cat out before heading up to bed. As was her custom at this point, she peered out of her window, her eyes fixated on Darren's house. She didn't want to miss anything. Then, just as she was about to get back into bed, she heard a loud thud. She didn't waste a moment and ran straight over to the window. To her surprise, Derek was pulling up to his house in his car, but this time he wasn't alone. What was he up to at this time of night? Where had he been? He got out of the car and made his way towards the trunk. Carol was convinced at this point that his secret was about to be revealed. What he took out of the trunk left a very uneasy feeling in Carol's stomach. He pulled a long, large bag out of his trunk. It looked like a bag of rubbish. It was difficult to make out exactly what it was from this distance and in the dark, but there was definitely something inside the bag. But what? The bag looked very heavy. It was so heavy that Derek was unable to carry it. The following morning, Carol told her husband what she had seen, but he thought that she was just going crazy. Carol was certain that she wasn't. She had seen this with her own eyes, and his behavior up until this point was just too strange. What she saw would be forever ingrained in her mind. She needed to do something and fast. There was only one way to find out the truth. This was the moment she'd have been waiting for. She couldn't relax until she had answers. As Carol stood in the kitchen, cup of tea in hand, she mulled over various options with regard to what she could do. She didn't have sufficient evidence to go to the police, and her husband didn't want to get involved, so he wouldn't help her. As she took a sip from her cup, she saw Derek leaving his house. He looked like something was bothering him as he hopped into his car and proceeded to speed off into the distance. Carol knew what she had to do. She wasn't proud of it, but this was the only way to find out the truth. As Carol watched Derek speed off into the distance, she grabbed her keys and left the house. She had no idea where Derek was going or how long he was going to be, so she knew she had no time to spare. She had to act quickly. Speeding out of her front door, she ran across to his house and blended in with the shrubbery, so as not to be seen. She hastily headed over to his back door. She was running out of time. She couldn't lose a moment. Carol snuck into Derek's garden, and to her surprise, the garden was completely immaculate. She walked through the garden and over to the back window. This was the moment that all of her questions would be answered. She had waited so long for this. As she peered in through the window, what she saw left her completely lost for words. Inside, it must have been only around 172 square feet. The entire space of the tiny house was divided into 4 sections on different levels of the floor. It looked as though the area under the floor of the kitchen was used to store a washing machine, and there was a sleeping area on the upper level. How could Derek live like this? Carol thought to herself. Then suddenly, all of her thoughts were halted as she heard her name being called. She swiftly turned around and saw Derek staring back at her. After an intense discussion with Derek, which lasted around an hour, Carol finally had the truth. It turned out that Derek had been living in this tiny house while he waited for construction to be finished on his new house. Carol was amazed to discover that Derek had done everything in this house by himself. Both the inside and the garden had been his doing. She was amazed and, at the same time, relieved to find out the truth at last.